Nobody teaches you about power in relationships, not directly. They talk about love, about compromise, about communication, as if those words explain why some people always feel like they are chasing and others always feel chased, as if kindness alone determines who stays and who eventually disappears. But here is what nobody ever tells you. Power in a relationship is not taken. It is quietly shifted. And most of the time, you hand it over without knowing it happened. There are 4 specific psychological moves that change the entire emotional dynamic between two people. And they work in complete silence. No confrontation, no negotiation, no announcement. Just a slow, invisible tilt that leaves one person wondering why everything suddenly feels different, and the other person wondering why they cannot imagine their life without you in it. By the end of this, you will not be able to unsee it. Most people think relationship power is about dominance. They picture the person who talks louder, who cares less, who makes the other one wait. They think it is something you fight for or perform in arguments and ultimatums. But that is not how it actually works. Real psychological power in a relationship does not announce itself. It does not arrive in a moment of control or a dramatic confrontation. It moves underneath the surface of every interaction, quiet and invisible, building over time until one person feels inexplicably drawn and the other feels inexplicably free. And the most unsettling part? The people who hold it rarely do so on purpose. They stumbled into certain patterns of presence and absence, of giving and withholding, that quietly rewired the emotional chemistry between them without a single conversation about it. What most people call chemistry, or magnetism, or simply the way two people are together, is almost always something more specific than that. It is the result of deeply embedded psychological patterns playing out beneath every word, every silence, every moment of closeness and distance. Once you understand what those patterns actually are, the experience of every relationship you have ever had begins to look completely different. You start to see the architecture beneath the emotion. And that is both clarifying and slightly uncomfortable to sit with. But this is where it gets darker. The first move is called strategic unavailability. And it is the one people misunderstand the most. Most people confuse this with playing hard to get, which is a shallow imitation of something far more psychologically complex. Strategic unavailability is not about ignoring someone or manufacturing distance to seem mysterious. It is about having a life that is genuinely full enough that you cannot always be reached, cannot always respond, and do not arrange your world around another person's emotional timeline. The psychological effect of this is profound, and it happens at the level of the brain's dopamine reward system. When someone is always available, always responsive, always present, the person they are with stops experiencing a dopamine response to their attention. There is no anticipation, no uncertainty, no small electric charge of wondering whether they will reach out. The relationship becomes neurologically predictable, and predictability, however safe it feels, is the quiet erosion of emotional pull. But when someone is genuinely invested in their own life, when their attention is something that has to be earned rather than simply assumed, the other person's brain registers their presence as something worth leaning toward. That subtle shift tilts the emotional balance of the entire relationship without either person being able to name exactly what changed. The second move is emotional composure under pressure. This one is harder because it requires something most people were never taught: the ability to remain internally still when the relationship feels destabilizing. When conflict arises, when distance appears without explanation, when silence stretches longer than feels comfortable, most people react. They reach out. They over-explain. They seek reassurance in ways that signal emotional need, even when they do not intend to. And every time that happens, a small but measurable amount of power transfers. Not because the other person is calculating it, but because their nervous system registers it. They feel the pull toward them tighten. Something inside them begins to feel subtly less drawn, slightly less curious. Emotional composure, on the other hand, communicates something entirely different. It says, I can hold my own internal experience without needing you to manage it for me. I exist fully, even when you are not close. That signal, even when wordless, rearranges the emotional dynamic in ways neither person can quite explain. And this is the part most people completely miss. The third move is selective depth, understanding when to reveal and when to stay quiet. Most people, when they feel connection forming, do the same thing instinctively. They open up, quickly, completely. They share their fears, their wounds, their history, their most tender places, as if the speed and fullness of disclosure equals the depth of intimacy. But social signaling research tells a different story. Revelation that comes too early, too fast, or without reciprocity does not build depth. It creates emotional asymmetry, a dynamic where one person knows far more about the other than the other knows about them. In that asymmetry, the person who disclosed everything becomes more emotionally invested, while the one who received it begins to feel a quiet sense of power they never asked for, and occasionally, a subtle loss of curiosity. Real depth is built through earned disclosure, through sharing enough that interest deepens, but not so much that mystery disappears. The person who understands this, who can hold something of themselves back not from fear but from self-awareness, becomes someone the other person cannot stop turning over in their mind. Because the feeling that there is always something more to understand about someone is one of the most compelling things the human mind can experience inside a relationship. The fourth move is non-reaction to emotional tests. Every relationship contains them, moments where one person, consciously or not, pushes to see what the other one will do. A sudden coldness after warmth, a withdrawal without explanation, a criticism that feels slightly unfair, a distance that was not earned. Most people react instinctively to these moments. They push back, shut down, overcompensate with kindness, or match the emotional weather with their own. Every reaction is a form of getting pulled into the other person's inner world, and every time you get pulled in, you demonstrate that their emotional state has the power to destabilize yours. That is the transfer of power. Not dramatic, not hostile, just two nervous systems working out who sets the emotional tone between them. The person who learns to observe these moments without being consumed by them, who can hold their own internal ground while the edges are tested, gradually becomes the one who defines how the relationship feels to both people inside it. Pause here for a moment and consider something honestly. Think about the last time you felt yourself losing ground in a relationship. Not because of anything that was said, but because of something you felt tilting beneath the surface. That slow, quiet shift where you became the one reaching more, waiting more, wondering more. Now ask yourself whether any of these four patterns were at play, not in the other person, but in yourself. Because here is what most people avoid looking at directly. The moves that shifted power away from you were not random. They followed a pattern, and patterns, once you can see them clearly, can be changed. This next part is the one that changes everything. The deepest truth about psychological power in relationships is not about strategy at all. It is about self-completeness. Every move described here, strategic unavailability, emotional composure, selective depth, non-reaction, these are not techniques you apply to another person. They are expressions of an inner state where your sense of value, your emotional stability, and your feeling of being enough do not depend on what another person gives or withholds. The people who shift power in relationships without trying are the people who are genuinely not performing wholeness. They are actually living inside it. They have their own emotional rhythms, their own direction, their own inner world that exists independently of the relationship. They do not need the dynamic to confirm their worth. And that quality, that quiet self-containment, is the most psychologically compelling thing one person can embody in front of another. The brain does not experience it as coldness. It experiences it as solidity, as something worth moving toward. But there is something even underneath that. Most people who feel powerless in their relationships are not powerless because of what the other person is doing. They are powerless because somewhere inside themselves, they do not yet believe they deserve love that does not require them to shrink. They over-explain because they do not trust that their truth, simply stated, is enough. They overgive because they fear that being present without performing is insufficient. They react to every emotional test, because they have never learned that stillness can be its own complete answer. The real shift, the one that quietly transforms every relationship you will ever be in, does not begin with changing your behavior. It begins with changing what you believe about yourself in the moments when no one is watching. What you now understand about power in relationships goes far deeper than most people are willing to look. These 4 moves are not about gaining an upper hand over someone. They are about reclaiming what was always yours, your own emotional ground, the ability to be present without being consumed, available without being desperate, open without becoming empty. The relationships that feel genuinely balanced, that feel alive and chosen rather than needed and obligated. They are built on exactly this foundation, not on games, not on calculation, but on 2 people complete enough within themselves that choosing each other is a decision they make freely, every single day, without fear forcing their hand. There is one more layer worth sitting with after everything you just heard, because understanding how power shifts between 2 people is only the beginning. What happens when someone starts to reclaim their own emotional ground, quietly, without announcement, and the person beside them begins to sense the shift before a single word has been spoken? What does that kind of silence mean? What does it feel like from the inside of a relationship that is tilting back into balance? That story lives somewhere else, and it starts with something most people are not prepared to face in themselves. Have you ever felt the power shift in a relationship? That quiet, specific moment when you realized you had become the one who needed it more, and never fully understood how it happened so silently? Tell me what that felt like in the comments. You are not the only one who has been there.